You may have your opinions already formed about the new hours of service rules. We have ours. But for the time being, it's the law of the land. Agree or disagree. But one thing is clear. When it comes to these new rules, there's a vast chasm of confusion and questions floating around. We've made the calls, done the research, and in this training session, we'll help remove the questions and hopefully give you, the driver, and your carrier, a clearer picture on the current federal hours of service. To get you there, we'll look at definitions and overview of the hours of service rules. The newest federal hours of service regulations put in place July 1st, 2013. How violations affect the driver and carrier, and federal versus state regulations. As always, you should understand your carrier's hours of service rules. If you don't know, you must ask. This is a highly important topic affecting both you and the carrier. With that said, let's get on with the training. As you may already know, the main purpose of the hours of service rules are to prevent accidents caused by driver fatigue. This is accomplished by limiting the number of driving hours per day and the number of driving and working hours per week. Commercial motor vehicle driver fatigue is a serious concern, and regulations are there to help drivers combat this issue by keeping them on a 21 to 24-hour schedule and maintaining a natural sleep-wake cycle called circadian rhythm. Drivers are required to take a daily minimum period of rest and allowed longer rest periods to combat the cumulative fatigue effects that accrue on a weekly basis. But before we get into the newest hours of service regulations, we need to establish a baseline of understanding to the terms used by the federal motor carriers and exactly what they mean. First, it's important to understand that the new hours of service rules, as we'll discuss, are federal, simply meaning they cover the entire country. However, there are several states that use state of hours service rules rather than federal. We'll discuss that one a bit later, but you must understand which type of carrier or driver you are. Interstate versus intrastate. All commercial drivers of property-carrying vehicles who drive interstate or across state lines must meet the standards of the Federal Highway Administration. Intrastate simply means you drive only within your state boundaries and are subject to federal rules only if your state has adopted federal standards. For example, California and Texas have adopted their own standards. If you operate only in those states, we'll discuss those at the end of this training session. 14-hour duty limit. You are allowed a period of 14 consecutive hours of duty time after being off duty for 10 or more consecutive hours. The 14 consecutive hour duty period begins when you start any kind of work, not just driving. Once you've reached the end of this 14 consecutive hour period, you can't drive again until you've been off duty for another 10 consecutive hours. Your driving is limited to the 14 consecutive hour duty period, even if you take some off-duty time, like a lunch break or a nap, during those 14 hours. For example, let's say you've been off for 10 or more consecutive hours and start work at 5 a.m. On duty not driving until 7 a.m. Then you drive for 10 hours until 5 p.m. You then go back on duty not driving. At 7 p.m. you'll have reached your maximum 14-hour duty limit. Even though you've only driven 10 hours, you've been on duty for 14 and can no longer drive. However, you still can remain on duty. There's been no change to this rule. 11-hour driving limit. The federal rule states that during the 14 consecutive hour duty period we just talked about, you're allowed to drive your truck for up to 11 total hours, which goes for both hazmat and non-hazmat. There's no limit on how many of those hours you're allowed to drive at one time. You may drive as little as a few minutes or as much as 11 hours in a row. But once you've driven a total of 11 hours, you've reached the limit and must be off duty for another 10 consecutive hours before driving your truck again. Again, there's been no change to this rule. There are two rules that allow for extensions to the 11-hour driving limit that we need to understand. First, a 2-hour extension is allowed one time per week for short-haul drivers, defined as drivers who stay within 100 or 150 air-mile radius of their original location. A 2-hour extension is also allowed for adverse driving conditions. Understand that this is for unforeseen and unexpected conditions not known when you started your run. These would include things like snow, fog, or a shutdown of traffic due to a crash. This doesn't include situations that you should have known about, such as congested traffic during typical rush hour periods. Also note that even though you're allotted a 2-hour extension to the driving limit, it does not allow you to drive after the 14-hour period previously discussed. Duty cycles. Under the federal regulations, you're required to follow one of the following limits. First, if your company operates less than 7 days a week, you as the driver are not allowed to drive after you've been on duty 60 hours during any 7 consecutive days on a rolling calendar. Once you hit the 60-hour limit, you can't drive again until you've dropped below 60 hours for a 7 consecutive day period. You are allowed to do other work, but can't drive until you're off duty enough days to get below the limit. Option 2. If your company does operate vehicles 7 days a week, you are allowed the 70-hour, 8-day schedule. Simply stated, you are not allowed to drive after you've been on duty 70 hours in any 8 consecutive days. Neither of these duty cycle options have been changed with the new hours of service regulations. This leads us to restart period, the 34-hour restart. Regulations allow a driver to reset or restart their 60 or 70-hour clock calculations after having at least 34 consecutive hours off duty. New regulation alert. This is one of the new changes to the hours of service as of July 1st, 2013. The FMCSA regulations now require that a 34-hour off-duty period will reset the 60 or 70-hour limit if it includes 2 consecutive periods from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., and a reset can only be started if 168 hours, or 7 days, have passed since the start of the last reset period. You might be scratching your head at the moment. So let's see a few examples to better understand this new regulation. Let's say you work under a 70-hour, 8-day cycle, and you're eligible to begin a restart period on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Under this new rule, you could not begin driving until Thursday at 5 a.m., a total of 36 hours. But why? Because you're required to have 2 consecutive periods from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. In this example, the first 1 through 5 would be Wednesday, and the second 1 through 5 would be Thursday morning. But remember the second change to restart periods. They can only be started if 168 hours, or 7 days, have passed since the start of the last rest period. In this example, say you started a restart on a Saturday at 5 p.m. You'd be allowed to drive again Monday at 5 a.m. You've had at least 34 hours off duty and 2 periods between 1 through 5 a.m. You wouldn't be able to begin another restart until the next Saturday at 5 p.m. This rule really only affects those drivers who work more than 70 hours a week on a continuing basis. Break requirements. Yes, breaks are now required under new hours of service regulations. The law states that if more than 8 consecutive hours on duty have passed since the last off-duty period of at least a half hour, a driver must take a break of at least 30 minutes before driving. So let's take a closer look at some of the important points of this rule. First, the 8 hours are consecutive and include both driving and all other time. If you're driving a commercial motor vehicle when you reach the 8 consecutive hour mark past the end of your last break of at least 30 minutes, you must stop driving. Now, this new law only affects drivers if they are driving a property-carrying commercial motor vehicle. If you're working but not driving at the 8-hour mark, then no break is required. In order to properly log the break, the time must be shown as off-duty or sleeper berth, which means you, the driver, must be free of all responsibilities to the vehicle. The only exception to this rule are for drivers transporting 1.1, 1.2, or 1.3 explosives. It's important to note here that the 30-minute break must be counted as part of the driver's 14-hour allowance. You don't get 14 hours of on-duty time plus a 30-minute break. It takes 30 minutes out of your 14-hour allowance. If you are not required to complete a daily log because of the 100 air mile radius or the non-CDL 150 air mile radius, you are still required to take a 30-minute break at or before the 8-hour mark. If you fall into this category, you're not required to log the break. However, these breaks are not included in the driver's total on-duty hours. Finally, unless transporting Class 1.1, 1.2, or 1.3 explosives, other hazmat drivers are subject to the 30-minute break requirements, and it must be time spent off duty and noted on the log.